So, good afternoon and welcome to the Institute for Humanities and Social Sciences here at Queen Mary University of London. Welcome in particular to this, our third annual symposium in the Humanities and Social Sciences on the matter of the limits of the disciplines in and after the pandemic. I was delighted when our speaker today, Professor Helen, accepted my invitation to present an argument which could say something about the state of the humanities today. COVID-19 has seen the humanities enrolled in the service of science and society, and we need a proper stocktake of where that leaves the public good of the humanities, particularly in the context of current economic and political pressures on university research. In other words, we need a cultural and intellectual diagnosis of the humanities in our time. Those of you who know Helen and know her work will also know why she is perhaps the perfect individual to take on this task. Now, before I introduce Helen properly, a few words, if I may, about tonight's lecture and why events like this are so critical to the work of the IHSS itself. The IHSS was established 4 years ago as a critical hub to enhance the interdisciplinary research environment here at Queen Mary, with a special emphasis on enabling the work of early career scholars. Why? To develop new critical thinking within the disciplines. We are 8 schools in this faculty after all, and through cross-disciplinary engagements between them. 3 years ago, when I took over as director of the Institute, the college made a major commitment to this objective by funding 16 new early career lecturer positions to function as a core part of the IHSS, alongside a small central team. And many of them are here tonight. Our mandate was fairly simple: do good work and think critically, but also constructively. And despite the pandemic, we have done good work, as a great many other colleagues across the faculty who have proposed new ideas and research initiatives. And so we have grown in the process to comprise a vibrant community of research centre leads, postdoctoral and early career networks, distinguished visiting fellows and working group members, including our current working group on the climate emergency. By this summer, when a second intake of 25 new IHSS fellows join us, we will comprise less a hub and more an intellectual college, with 4 new programs on digital lives, environmental futures, rethinking work and global epistemologies, and the arrival of 10 IHSS Global Professorial Fellows who will work with us over the next 2 years or so. The IHSS is now a community of 57 directly affiliated staff and a great many more collaborators across our working groups, research programs, and our visiting fellows schemes. So in just 3 years then, the IHSS has grown, despite the digital pivot, into an important part of college life and the national scholarly scene. We're a part of the UK Consortium of Institutes of Advanced Studies and of growing relevance at the international scale, as the recent heavy interest in our Global Fellows Scheme or our collaborative workshop with the Miami Institute of Social Sciences both demonstrate. But somewhat closer to home, I hope that some of our now habitual programs, be it the book launches we host, our own seminar series and workshops, be it our once a semester faculty forum addressing issues in scholarship from decolonising HSS to the question of academic time, or indeed our more informal institute afternoons, all are also testament to the energy created and generated in and around the IHSS, and that energy in its turn enlarges the practical and intellectual space for colleagues within the faculty to convene and to develop together the ideas that put the humanities and social sciences at the forefront of scholarly and public discussion. Now, all of this has happened during the global pandemic, from which Helen's lecture tonight takes its cue. That hasn't stopped us hosting 2 prior annual symposium lectures by Thomas Piketty and Shoshana Zuboff, but I am relieved that this time at least, somehow, we get to meet in person. And I'm also mindful that this will be my last annual lecture as director, as I leave Queen Mary this summer to continue my own disciplinary peregrinations abroad. And if I may, Helen, I'd like to take this opportunity to personally thank our Vice Principal, Matthew Hilton, for the opportunity to have led the IHSS over the past 3 years, as well as Adrian Smith, who I think more than anyone set the cogwheels of the IHSS in motion, and to the Dean of Research, Adrian Armstrong, whom I've had the privilege to work alongside very closely these past few years. Let me also wish the new director, Professor Kate Mallison, the very best of luck as she takes forward the work that we have begun. It's been such a privilege to build and to lead this growing scholarly community. I joined QMUL in 2004, not even quite out of my PhD. I can honestly say that despite all the challenges and the great or not so great digital pivot, I've never enjoyed the labour of scholarship as much as I have developing this institute. And I hope that continues and that the critical ethos we have established here will continue to be nurtured. And so to tonight's speaker, for whom the critical ethos is second nature. Professor Helen Small is Merton Professor of English, Language and Literature at the University of Oxford. Her research addresses the connections between literature, intellectual history and philosophy, especially moral and critical philosophy, primarily since 1830. She is the author of numerous books applying the tools of each of these disciplines to matters of interest, including The Long Life, published in 2007 with Oxford, which considers the matter of old age from a literary and philosophical perspective. 2013's The Value of the Humanities, also with Oxford, which is a critical account of the claims standardly employed to defend the public value of the humanities. And more recently, The Function of Cynicism at the Present Time, published, timely enough, in 2020. Professor Small regularly writes essays about Victorian fiction, poetry, and public moralism, and she has edited several well-known and less well-known 19th century literary works, including Vanity Fair, Wuthering Heights, The Lifted Veil and Brother Jacob, and with Stephen Wall, Little Dorrit. She's on the editorial board of the Journal of Victorian Culture and the advisory board of History of the Humanities, and she continues to work critically on questions of ageing and the quality of public discourse. She is also here in the room with us today, and rather than hearing me drone on anymore, as I'm sure you are all looking forward to hearing Helen share her thoughts with us, let me just leave you with a couple of housekeeping notes that the fire exits are here behind me. Those of you watching later will have to take responsibility for your own. And to let you know that Helen will speak for around 45 minutes, and after that the two of us will delve into some of the themes in a little more detail before we open it up to questions from the floor. Thereafter, you are all solidly welcome to join us for a wine reception in the foyer outside. Helen, please. The floor is yours.
Thank you very warmly, Simon. It's a delight to be here and in person after 2 years. I haven't exactly worked on the paper for the whole 2 years, but I have worked on it, I promise. Thank you for the hospitality, and I'm kind of excited that it's your last day. I think that's a wonderful opportunity for what might be, in effect, an exit interview from the institution, in which all holes are barred on what you might want to say about not just this institution, not particularly this institution, but UK academia. So I hope the conversation will be particularly rich in that context. I'm conscious that some of you have come quite some distance to be here, so thank you very much, whatever distance you've come. Right, I'm not good at being the upbeat, positive advocate telling you everything we do is marvellous about the humanities and social sciences. I tend to think those conversations become very self-congratulatory and don't go anywhere very deep. So forgive me if there is some of my characteristic acidity in corners of this. I've tried to modulate that a bit, but also to try to say something new. About the condition of the humanities and social sciences. There is a little bit of this paper that has a particular brief of direction towards funding councils, and that's for particular reasons of where I see difficulties in the system at the moment. It's not a criticism of what the funding councils are doing, it's an attempt at diagnosing where we could all do better still. Enough preamble. So the title is The Humanities in and After the Pandemic. It's the function of epigraphs to set a train of thought running, sometimes more by how they diverge in content and in tone than by how closely they align. Two epigraphs then. The first is from the University of Chicago philosopher Agnes Callard, writing in The New Yorker during the initial US wave of the pandemic. The second's from the 2021 IFS annual lecture given by the Nobel laureate in economics, Jean Tirole, and published online. Both these academics, given an intellectual platform for addressing publics beyond their academic expertise, were provoked into thinking about the pressures exerted against traditional models of public intellectualism by by the COVID-19 pandemic. So the first, Agnes Callard, perhaps the special danger of a crisis that leaves a lot of time for thinking is that one will try to learn too many lessons while inside it. Crises are, at least while they are happening, not educational opportunities. They are events that befall us, that harm us. And the second from Tirol, I don't think COVID is going to be a catalyst for change, but clearly we must use social sciences more broadly in order to understand the reluctance of people to adopt policies we find kind of obvious. In both these cases, the pandemic concentrated the mind on problems in our contemporary public life which were well recognized before the crisis, but have become more sharply accentuated and perhaps a little better defined over the last 2 years. Whether or not this audience thinks they're starting to be better addressed may well reflect the level of your optimism, and since optimism is still, I think, in a bit of short supply, I will try to offer encouragements. I have in view two primary difficulties. The first is the ongoing problem of challenges to the authority of expertise. The second is the uneasy relation between distinct forms of disciplinary understanding as they're brought to bear on matters of common experience, and concern. These two things are related insofar as Tirol and many others have suggested that fixing the conversation between disciplines would help us address the trust in expertise problem. The main purpose of this lecture is to try to articulate what I think still stands in the way of making that happen, despite some very large sums of government and philanthropic money dedicated to interdisciplinary collaboration. I'm interested in what a practice of intellectual leadership genuinely open to disciplinary difference needs to look like. Given the constituency of this audience, I'll concentrate primarily on the humanities and social sciences, but in principle, what I'm saying could be extended across all our academic disciplines. So Callard first. Like many academics in the US and UK, Agnes Callard maintains a dual career, combining academic writing, books and journal articles largely concentrated on ancient philosophy and modern ethics, with public philosophy. She writes a monthly column for Point Philosophy, frequent pieces for the New York Times, gives regular interviews and records podcasts. At roughly the point where the American death toll overtook that of Italy to become the highest in the world, and US campuses were closing, moving learning online, including at the University of Chicago, Callard contributed a long essay to the New Yorker's Annals of Inquiry column. She reflected on the similarities and the far more profound differences between her response to a public crisis and that of someone she holds up as an intellectual hero, Jean Améry. The choice was challenging. An Austrian Jew born Hans Meyer, Améry wrote movingly in his essays, Callard observes, of how his own humanistic learning failed him during the Second World War. Faced with the sheer physical brutality of the concentration camps, he came to see the intellectual life as a game and intellectuals as nothing more than homines ludentes. Tortured by the Gestapo, he knew the limits of his own courage, and he came to see his own lack of heroism as consistent with the failure of most others like him, humanists, philosophers, skeptics, who fell into despair by contrast with those practical people and people of belief, Marxists, Catholics, practicing Jews, whose participation in a larger struggle enabled them to live a life in the concentration camps consistent with the life they'd lived before. For Callard, the point of reflecting on Améry in March 2020 wasn't to repeat or scrutinize his counsel of educational despair that is at the humanities' inevitable incompetence to face down the brutality of fascism adequately. It is rather to provide a handle on the peculiar aspect of the COVID-19 crisis. So unless we're medics or public health practitioners or epidemiologists or at the front line of care, the pandemic has probably required little more of many of us in the academy than the ability to adapt to more constrained circumstances of operation. The coronavirus is, as she puts it provocatively, for the vast majority of us, a call to inaction. If we're lucky, we still have had work to do, we've enjoyed sufficiently unimpaired health, and the really exempt will have had no children to entertain or people close to them in need of care. We, it's an embarrassed we, turn inward, she says, with little to offer a world preoccupied by outward emergency of a very particular kind. But then comes a rhetorical about-face. The inward turn, she suggests, is not parce Améry our failing. Contemplation is a calling. It's not a cause or a belief. It is, as Aristotle had it, inaction for a higher purpose. The pursuit of leisure, scholae for intellection. Scolet admits contemplation of the human condition, of what it means to live under the shadow of death, of what, I would add, it means to care for those more deeply under that shadow than we are ourselves. More than that, it allows the groundwork for the primary contribution the humanities make to society, she suggests, communicating the fruits of our contemplation to others, helping them to see their condition more richly, more meaningfully. If Callard sounds at this point suspiciously self-serving, well, there is another turn to come. Like how many of us, judging herself by the Aristotelian standard, she has apparently failed dismally. She has, it seems, watched far too much Netflix. She's allowed the kids to glue themselves to their screens for far too long. She signally failed to acquire new acres of hinterland, she tells us, and she's written and read less, not more. Is this a failure of humanism, she asks? No, it's a failure of crisis. Crises are, at least while they are happening, not educational opportunities. They are events that befall us, that harm us. By its very existence, Callard's essay speaks against her, if only up to a point. It's a short piece, it's a little over 2,000 words. It probably won't count much towards her next promotion exercise, but it's a sign of changed times that presumably will count for something. It's a deftly thought-provoking essay, and its stylistic features interest me as a literary critical observer of the developing genre of public humanism, public humanities writing. As my brief summary, I hope, makes clear, it's a piece that rests structurally on repeated wrong footing of the reader. Universities are cloistered gardens, it begins. The classroom is the innermost sanctum of that cloister, where worldly demands can be blocked out long enough for a group of people, some of whom had no prior interest, to share a poem by Horace or an argument by Aristotle. Callard isn't exactly leading us down the garden path. I take it she expects us to know how to read this. She's setting up a long historic ideal, an version of the university, that even in a place still as well provided with cloisters as some of our universities still are, can be invoked in 2021 only in order to be inevitably dismantled. It's a trope whose function here is obviously ironic, a pointed misdescription of the centrally timetabled, health and safety controlled academic classroom, which starts to look like an inner sanctum only when contrasted with the less manageable reality of the family home as workplace. If you didn't spot the irony at the opening, you should surely recognize the sharper qualifications around the invocation of Améry, the exemplary intellectual who lost faith in what we do, the suicide as hero. And then we get the case for Aristotelian leisured contemplation, only for that too to be abandoned as unworkable for this modern, domestically encumbered academic. Finally, Callard presents us with a more modest, complicated, and psychologically embattled version of intellectual heroism in the figure of the student, a type we can all, she trusts, bring to mind, full of unspoken brilliance, and finally finding the courage to speak in a seminar or lecture. It's a type we can hope to see again when the crisis is over, she says, and we're back in the classroom able to help that moment happen. This is her. Every teacher knows that intellectual heroics are real. It is, I'm tempted to say, a very American conclusion, protected by so much irony along the way. In the end, it wears its sincerity and its optimism on its sleeve. Jean Tirole, delivering the Institute for Fiscal Studies annual lecture before a live audience of around 100, was operating in a more closely defined public arena. The podcast recording had 500 plus views over the first week. It's had a little over 1,000 via YouTube since. Those aren't huge figures. Institutional ambitions have been reset during the pandemic. So to use an example close to home, one of my colleagues lectured online about Shakespeare and the plague during the first lockdown and accumulated 138,000 plus Facebook live feeds. And I won't give you the YouTube figures. If Tirole's immediate audience was select, it was invited with a view to impact. Economists, economic commentators, journalists, funding body representatives, and some politicians. The particular lecture in this case has something of the flavour of a book talk. I haven't checked in detail, but my sense is that it bears a close resemblance to other talks that he's given over the past 4 years, following the publication of Economics for the Common Good in 2017, which means that it forms part of a set of public intellectual pronouncements, each directed at a slightly different audience, often in different geographic locations, cumulatively spreading the message. Economics for the Common Good is stamped with an explicit acknowledgement and some interesting notes of ambivalence about Tirole's sense of being pushed into the role of public intellectual by award of the Nobel Prize. The book's blurb puts that context up front. When Jean Tirole won the 2014 Nobel Prize in Economics, his sudden transformation from academic economist to public intellectual prompted him to reflect further on the role economists and their discipline play in society. The result is a passionate manifesto for a world in which economics, far from being a dismal science, is a positive force for the common good. The heart of both book and lecture is Tirole's frustration at the gap between what we understand, that's an economistic we, extendable to all rationally minded persons, and the actions that a broader we, I take that to be politicians, policymakers, and more general public, are willing and able to affect in the world. Tirole's willing to present himself as part of the problem. We must all, he says, take responsibility for our limited understanding of economic phenomena, our desire to believe what we want to believe, our relative intellectual laziness, and our cognitive biases. We all have the ability to understand economics, but as I've already shown, errors in reasoning cannot necessarily be explained away by IQ or educational level. Both book and lecture show considerable interest in recent research in psychology and behavioral science, exploring why people reason badly. Part of the problem's simple inattention, not taking the problems seriously enough. Popular culture, he thinks, is a distraction. Let's admit it. Sorry about this, I should have checked where my slides go. Let's admit it, it's easier to watch a film or devour a good thriller than to launch into a book on economics. This isn't a criticism, by the way. I myself read too little about climate science, he says, about biotechnology, medicine, and other scientific fields that influence public policy design. But a larger part of the explanation lies with how seductive irrationality can be. Wishful thinking, the hope for a bright future, narrow perspective taking, personal narratives, he calls them, in lieu of big data. Confusions of correlation and causality, making excuses for antisocial behavior. Flimsy situational excuses, for example. Why do people so quickly find and take advantage of wriggle room, he asks, to avoid doing what is clearly rationally the right thing? If I, a doctor, do not prescribe opioids for my patient, someone else surely will do so, and it might as well then be me. I might be safer, my supplies are more trustworthy, I can keep an eye on my patient, and so forth. This kind of thing drives Tirole mad. The answer, he concludes, can't simply lie in spotting the errors. There's been plenty of trenchant work there to help us. Rather, economists and rational thinkers, more generally, are going to have to go outside their comfort zone, he argues, and have more to do with narrative. Where the debate is at, he says, is on narratives. It's the wriggle room bit. The argument then stops at precisely the point where a literary critic like myself would like it to pick up speed. Quite what Tirole understands to be involved in getting serious about narrative isn't quite clear. It's beyond his brief. He suggests at one point that understanding more about the tricks narratives use will be important. The story I may choose to tell you about a bad immigrant who comes to the country of choice and abuses its hospitality too easily proves much more powerful in public debate than any data the social scientist produces about overall patterns, tendencies, facts of immigrant behavior. This bothers him. People don't react to the data, as he puts it. They forget. They quote totally wrong numbers, e.g. on immigration. They want to believe what they want to believe. For a social scientist, narrative is not something interesting because it's not a basis on which to take decisions. Sure, I can find an immigrant who committed a crime, but I can also find a narrative about an immigrant which is going to make you feel good about immigrants, and I prefer the latter, but in a sense, none of them is scientific, right? The trouble is, this is a much, much more powerful way of communicating. He says statistics don't work, they don't work well, which is terrible because we think the facts are important and that's what should drive policy. At which point, he waxes briefly literary on home ground, Marcel Proust. The facts do not penetrate the world where our beliefs lie. That's a very nice way of saying it, better in French. We are, as I read it, back to irony and the role that it plays in offering to modify the potential self-aggrandizement of the public intellectual trained in a particular discipline, modifying his or her hopes for what can be achieved by exemplary reasoning, according to that discipline, in the public sphere. I've spent this long on just two examples of public intellectualism during the pandemic because scientifically unrepresentative though these examples must be, they seem to me indicative of changes in the culture and in the media supporting public intellectual work that pandemic restrictions on live audiences have considerably accelerated. Anyone who speaks beyond the academy and beyond the immediate confines of their expertise to address subjects of broad interest, as these two writers do, reflecting on the future of work, the content of education, the looming environmental crisis, widening inequalities during COVID, and so forth, does so knowing that the audience that they reach is divided, not just along political grounds, but through the fracturing effects of multi-disaggregated media. It is, we all know, at once easier to reach audiences of scale than it has ever been, and much harder to reach attitudinally diverse audiences. It's harder also to hold them, and it's almost impossible to integrate them. It's always been the case that readers could lose interest and put down a book or article or quietly exit the room. Television viewers still can, tune out or off. A lecture or conference audience can doodle on the printed program or keep an eye on emails while listening. But we now have technologies of consumption that allow for greater ruthlessness, and the institutions that once constrained our ruthlessness as consumers of text and speech are in some respects weaker. Your students, like mine, are almost certainly watching your lectures, if at all, and gutting the content, racing through on 2 or 4 times normal speed, skipping along the time bar to check for material of obvious relevance to their purposes. This isn't so much inattention as highly selective attention. Rhetoric, as scholars of digital media tell us, has consequently moved of late closer and closer to indexicality. Simple, if not pure indexicality. There's no such thing as pure indexicality. But on the narrowing platform between a lecture, a short podcast, a tweet, and an emoji, holding an audience with your language becomes, to borrow a famous phrase from Elizabeth Bishop, an art of losing. Tenuousness of platform, uncertainty of audience, weakness of institutional controls on the consumption of media interests me less on this occasion than the challenge of working beyond your own expertise. That challenge presses on what both Callard and Tirole have to say as they consider the disciplinary limits of the humanities and economics, respectively. For Callard, it's potentially a crippling recognition for a humanist that you may have little relevant expertise to offer in a coronavirus pandemic. The best we may offer is important, but it's hardly as pressing as the contribution of our colleagues in the medical sciences. We foster the work of contemplation, thinking deeply about what it means to be human at such a time, and we teach that contemplation. For Tirole, it's equally troubling to face the limits of what economics can achieve, set as it must be in a culture, Proust's world, where people don't always listen or listen well to reason. Each of these people understands the desirability of connecting out to other disciplines, respecting forms of knowledge they don't themselves possess. And in each case, the work of public intellectualism stops rhetorically at that point. Something to do with the medium, the occasion, of course. The respectful look over the podium, as it were, for other voices to join in conversation. There's a problem here, or a challenge, that goes well beyond the self-determining limits of 2 recent performances of public intellectualism. It's a problem every cross-disciplinary funding body faces as it looks to meet 2 not often congruent criteria: the desire to find answers to questions of public import, and the desire to be seen to respect all forms of disciplinary endeavour. Having sat on enough funding committees, assisted and reviewed a great many grant applications, as I'm sure most of us have, and repeatedly seen how much easier it is for some disciplines and some strands within disciplines to put themselves at the service of a wider collective endeavour than others. And I tend to think that anthropologists have a built-in advantage as students of culture, also historians as students of a past in which disciplines sat in nearer conjunction or hadn't yet crystallised. My sense is that we don't yet have very satisfactory ways of articulating articulating complementarity in knowledge. That is, articulating what happens when we draw deeply on the expertise of intellectuals whose modes of working, understanding evidence, criteria for knowledge, and priorities of perspective do not and perhaps cannot add up to a common research endeavour. Grant bodies typically work around this by packaging work, so that experts or investigators lead on their own terrain, and the work of bringing it all together sometimes seems to rest as much on the facility of a website designer as it does on the capacity of the team to formulate statements on which they can all agree as to their truth, agree as to their being worth saying at all. There is, I think, a real problem with the blandification of findings at the point of interdisciplinary research summary. I can think of exceptions, but as a very broad statement, I think I'm happy to put my oomph behind that one. Let me turn then to a philosopher who I found helpful in the past and who's recently published some preliminary thoughts that give clearer articulation to why it's genuinely hard to pursue cogent interdisciplinary intellectual endeavours. When you float an argument for a factual or explanatory claim, Elijah Milgram observes, it almost always comes with ceteris paribus, other things equal clauses, implicitly or explicitly. Most of our reasoning is, to use the technical term, defeasible, subject to the qualifications and objections we can think of that would alter or defeat the claims we've made. This isn't just a matter of distraction or not keeping our eye on the goal, opting for the wriggle room of bad decision-making that worried to roll. It's a feature of all non-deductive reasoning which doesn't guarantee the truth of its conclusions by its own premises. We're not, Milgram suggests, very good at understanding it. We're not very good at knowing what to do with this sort of open-endedness. Most of the advice out there amounts to look around and try to understand what might go wrong with your train of thought. But since there are always more things to check, how do you tell when you've checked enough? As a general problem, that's tough enough. But it seems to become even harder, Milgram adds, when we think about how it's inflected by the need to cooperate across different areas of specialized disciplines. Let me fillet out the essentials of an argument that's subtler and more complex than I can do justice to on this occasion. Disciplinary knowledge is specific. It rests on the mastery of particular vocabularies, terms of art, tools, and procedures of trade. Many of them, as Milgram puts it, tacitly absorbed through years of immersion in the field. If you don't have that immersion, that training, you probably can't get very far. You'll certainly be limited by some pretty basic parameters of operation: control of the language, ability to differentiate a good from a bad performance within the discipline. Not least, and I think this is actually one of the hardest things to do outside one's own discipline, a sense of what is new, valid, and of value from what is old, stale, redundant, or wrong. Many of us spend a lot of time encouraging our students, our graduates especially, to do what they can to overcome these barriers. But Milgram has some chagrining things to say about how easily we overestimate what is achievable. When you have to work with people in other fields, you develop interactional expertise. You do catch problems and get things to work. You even get good at it. There are various things we routinely do in daily life, even to improve the way these sorts of issues play out. But remember that anticipating some problems isn't the same thing as being able to be confident that you've identified all the important ones. Because we don't know about what we haven't noticed, we tend to overestimate how good we are at this. Not wanting to discourage, Milgram expends some effort describing how we might make a problem amenable to a variety of interdisciplinary approaches, a diversity of reframings within which considerations that defeat one line of approach won't normally defeat or even register as relevant for others. It's by no means a perfect solution, perhaps most obviously knowing whether a consideration does or doesn't defeat any given approach doesn't seem to be something you can decide from outside the system, from some ideal pan-disciplinary viewpoint. You're going to need, he says, exactly the kind of specific expertise that presented you with a problem in the first place. Only lots of it, all of it. We can try, we can take advice, and humility will get us further than persisting isolated in our own fields. It's only at the very end of this paper that Milgram admits a consideration a literary critic would probably love to see allowed entrance much earlier on. A significant factor in the non-congruity of our disciplines, even now, is that we don't all deal in arguments. To present the problem of how our various fields of expertise are to work together as a problem of argumentative coordination is then to assume wrongly that presenting arguments, defining their forms of reasoning, is what we all do. Milgram concedes, I have found that way of talking to provoke replies from academics trained in other fields along the lines of, an experiment isn't an argument, it's an experiment. We can now see that those replies reflect the way that different fields have different proprietary intellectual tool sets. The philosophers are used to representing things as arguments. It's their medium, their theoretical paint. And so when a philosopher addresses a problem or tries to make a point, it will normally be rendered in that medium and often seem to be about argumentation. Happily, this weakening of the claims of argument doesn't scupper the viability of testing an overarching insight by approaching it from a plurality of disciplinary vantage points. Our confidence in an idea, he concludes, should still increase as it finds support from multiple competencies, from scientific experiment, philosophical argument, economic modeling, anthropological inquiry, linguistic analysis, immersive cultural contextualization, narrative articulation. You can add to the list. This isn't the place, and I haven't the time to say much about why narrative has, I think, fairly recently been afforded so much prominence in arguments about which competency we might be most missing in the public domain. I have Tirol, of course, in view here as one among many examples. But it is perhaps worth saying that a mistake, or at least an unhelpful shorthanding, seems to me to be happening, whereby listening to narrative is often deemed to be the same as listening to the culture as a whole. Narrative is too large and complex a category to bear that weight. Like data or models, it imports an entire body of articulated content, highly diverse in quality, in origin, in purpose, in meaning. Angela Woods offers a very welcome summary of what's too often missed when, for example, scholars in the humanities and social sciences mobilize narrative to understand the experience of health and illness. She articulates 7 dangers, of which I would myself particularly want to accent her last 2. The truth value of narrative, she says, can never be taken for granted. Narrative coherence isn't in and of itself a good thing or any guarantor of truth. The term's too often extended to forms of self-expression for which other descriptions would be better. You're really dealing with images, for example, rather than with narrative. Other examples there. Distinctions between different forms and purposes of storytelling are too often collapsed. So we talk about anecdotes, interviews, sustained testimony, and so forth as if they were the same thing or operating according to the same principles. Sustained accounts of genre are too often absent. Cultural and historical dimensions of narrative form are easily lost. And promoting particular forms of narrative expression entails promoting particular ways of thinking about the self, too many of which entail limiting or inflexible assumptions about identity. What this suggests to me, or what these 2 things together, Milgram on defeasibility and Woods more briefly and negatively on narrative, not being able to cover that whole terrain that Milgram is saying we're in need of bringing together. What they suggest to me together is that efforts at articulating an intellectual insight born of joined competence at a level rarely, if ever, feasible for individual experts need to have built into them something like a defeasibility awareness, which might, from the vantage point of my own discipline, equate quite closely with an intellectual modesty trope. Defeasibility awareness is what I see in practice at the point where CalArt or any other humanities public intellectual acknowledges that the humanities can't contribute to vaccine development or do much in the way of assisting public uptake even, but may still be doing valuable work contemplating what it means to live for a time under an enlarged shadow of death and require more generous systems of care, or what it means for a culture to watch a pandemic play out rather like Camus' Plague and find material there to help us understand the limits of number, the ineradicable need for a plurality of narratives, or what it needs to see COVID increasing inequalities, not just out of economic insecurity, but out of access to education and to culture and so forth. Defeasibility awareness, it's a little more reluctant, if I gauge the tone correctly, is also at work when Tirole recognizes that economists might need to suspend their bafflement and even in some cases their irritation to work on narrative with people who understand what it imports for better and for worse to the business of reasoning and decision making. I would add to Milgram, though I'm just going to be gestural here, that we do have a credible operative model in the daily life of our disciplines, which we don't talk very much. Our disciplines are extraordinarily diverse in their content. So on a daily basis, so I talk, for example, to colleagues in the English faculty in my own university, I'm dealing with people who have expertise of which I have really no depth whatsoever. Old English, Old Norse, linguistics, whatever it is. But we have ways of talking across those gaps and bringing them together in an articulated account of what a broader discipline might be. That is, I think, one useful way of thinking about the enlarged exercise that is rational public conversation. The challenge of mutual recognition across disciplines is undoubtedly greater than recognizing complementary expertise within the semi-devolved internal structures of disciplines. Many good minds have addressed that challenge, opening up whole fields of cross-disciplinary endeavor that enable even quite remote forms of expertise to speak to one another. Economics and literature, for example, physics and theology, poetry and medicine. Typically, but not always, they find a broker in history or in anthropology or in the creative arts, admitting ways of standing above or, as it were, before the divisions of modern subject specialization. Much of this dedicated cross or interdisciplinary scholarship emanates from the kinds of internal critical awareness of disciplinary limitation that I wrote about in The Value of the Humanities, whereby emphasis on disciplinarity breeds interdisciplinarity and vice versa as a kind of structural symbiosis or oscillation right from the start. Using the creative arts seems to me bypasses the problem altogether, since the creative practitioner can work largely free of academic norms and standards and can, to a degree, remediate the problem altogether. The challenge of working with other differently versed experts is an everyday difficulty of the university. It's experienced by all of us as inhabitants of disciplines, with a degree of curiosity about what our colleagues are doing in other classrooms, libraries, laboratories. The harder obstacles in the way of a serious cross-disciplinary collaboration of intelligence in which the humanities plays its full part are those that arise when the pressure comes from outside the system. Not the pressure to hear other forms of intelligence that arises as an internal corrective or extension of your own thinking, but rather the pressure placed on the system from without, typically by governments or agencies looking to the university for solutions to recognized challenges in the way of human flourishing or environmental protection. The problems we're enjoined to help solve at this level are almost always wicked problems, or very often wicked problems. Famously defined by Horst Rittel and Melvin Weber in their 1973 paper, Dilemmas in a General Theory of Planning, wicked problems or wicked questions are those problems in social policy for which any attempt at a scientific resolution is bound to fail. As Rittel and Weber famously put it, policy problems of this order of complexity cannot be definitely described. Moreover, in a pluralistic society, there's nothing like the indisputable public good. There's no objective definition of equity. Policies that respond to social problems cannot be meaningfully correct or false, and it makes no sense to talk about optimal solutions unless severe qualifications are imposed first. Even worse, there are no solutions in the sense of definite and objective answers. Wicked problems, sometimes wicked questions, quickly became a fond term of art in the sphere of policy making, and it's made a, to me, quite striking return, especially in America, in efforts to articulate what the humanities are bringing to wider social challenges. It's creeping in, but it's creeping in with remarkable regularity of late. We don't, I think, need the more recent amping up of the register recommended by commentators on climate change, a super wicked problem. The difference ostensibly is that where super wicked problems are concerned, the agents tasked with finding a solution are themselves part of the problem. Governments, corporations, wedded to and investing in failing to expunge fossil fuels, for example, or carbon-emitting technologies. To return to the original paper is to find that stickiness of conflicting interests already factored in. There are no true or false answers to wicked problems because no one, they write, is in a position to operate free of their group or personal affiliations, their ideological predilections. No one's free to rise above the conflicts and operate as objective or even sufficiently objective judge. It's surely not an accident that the Wicked Problems paper was published 2 years after John Rawls's enormously influential formulation of the veil of ignorance principle in his theory of justice, 1971. Wicked problems mark the point at which the social scientist turns to the philosopher and pronounces a limit case for the social application of disinterestedness. Where Rawls advises us to put justice to the theoretical test of not knowing what position we will occupy in a just society, young, old, able, disabled, black, white, rich, poor, anywhere in between, Rittel and Weber tell us that in practice we're inextricable from the social mess, the mess of interests, ideology, conflicting priorities, conflicting goods. Now, one way of taking you to a conclusion from this would be to talk about systems theory and the ways in which systems theory has or hasn't taught us a different way of dealing with wicked problems. But I want to give you instead a practical example of why it might be still really, really difficult to get the kind of joined intelligence that I think we all want and are all in various ways contributing to fashioning, but it's the difficulty of doing it that is clearly my chosen subject today. So I want to give you a wicked problem, one that's persistently found a place amid the grand challenges posed by national governments over many years, one I'm wrestling with in my own attempts to formulate a genuinely value-added collaboration of research interests between different divisions of the university. And I will allow myself to say one I'm also wrestling with, as so many of us are, in family life at present, and one that the pandemic has given new urgency in the public eye. So this is the question: what would it take in the way of economic investment, social and legal reform, achievable medical improvements, cultural understanding, ethical wisdom, and political will to deliver a decent, sustainable, and sufficiently equitable system of care for the old? I'll keep my eye on the UK context, but it's worth saying at the outset that the UK is far from alone in the difficulties it faces in trying to raise the level of late life care provision. Very differently financed and culturally situated as their care systems are most countries in Europe, Scandinavia, North America, Australasia, others I'm sure have since the 1990s seen systemic failures in care standards. a general depletion of late life care in favour of critical care, private provision increasingly taking over from public with corresponding increases in inequality. Few have escaped the kind of public soul-searching that followed horribly disproportionate deaths from COVID-19 in UK care homes during the first wave of the pandemic. Let me try to articulate briefly why care of the aged is a wicked problem par excellence and what we might reasonably expect of collaboration between the humanities and other disciplines in that context. So why is it wicked? First, there's no general agreement possible, I think, on what an acceptable standard of expectation for old age care should be. I know that sounds a hard thing to say, but I think it's probably true. By default, we have systems that are profoundly inequitable, but those systems are also inhabited by individuals and groups who don't agree, possibly could never agree on what is needed, what is wanted, who counts as old, and why, what forms of care should be deemed requisite and which are merely desirable. We have economic and legal markers of normative aging, pensionability, retirement still, but they are increasingly not applicable to all, and almost everyone would agree they're not fit to guide us in defining old age, though they are arguably better than nothing as indicators that we should still have some kind of normative expectations around social support in later life. What we allocate to the old necessarily entails judgments of distributive justice, and the pandemic gave us a very painful lesson in the trade-offs that are made between our duties to the vulnerable old and our duties to other vulnerable groups, especially children. It's all very well to argue, as I did in the long life, that we should be guided first by prioritarian judgments of greatest need, but there's no such thing as a clean choice of priorities. More wicked still, we inhabit a cultural landscape that is quite incoherent in the way in which it invites us to understand care of the old. We are palpably failing in general in care, but the knowledge and feeling of that failure hasn't as yet been enough to drive collective social action. When I look at the humanistic literature on old age care from very recent years, just before and during the pandemic, it tells me several things that I find keenly interesting and very hard to put together. So one significant strand of that literature, building on work in ethics of care from Carol Gilligan and Ned Noddings onwards, tells me that we've reached a point in the discussion when we might profitably move on from thinking about the dynamic between carer and cared for, with all its ambivalences and its ideological freighting, gender included, and recognize care as an inextricable element of all human lives and a core component of what we mean by community. If you want a good example of that, have a look at Talia Schaffer's recent book, Humanities of Care, which explicitly frames its rereading of Victorian care cultures in relation to our reevaluation, and primarily the US reevaluation of care during the pandemic. Another strand of writing invites me to think about the different temporalities of disability and the care they enjoin us to, making individual and collective allowance for crip time, enforced slowing down or intermittent engagement, with all its implications for institutional and private life. Yet another enjoins me to what Bruce Robbins has in another context called civilizational self-accusation with respect to pandemic care home deaths. There's no good story to tell about the mortality data on COVID and old age. The 19,000 care home resident deaths attributed to COVID in England and Wales in the first wave of the pandemic account for almost a third of all deaths. That figure is now presumed to be an underestimate given the low level of testing in care homes. But what's the extent of our collective social failure there? Excess deaths from COVID, we're now told by care specialists, were very likely attributable more to the effects of the disease in older, frail patients, older, frail bodies, than to demonstrable neglect. Don't be too reassured, the same experts admonish a better funded, better staffed, better managed system of community care would surely have improved the outcomes for the vulnerable old. How far? That question's possibly unanswerable. A key term here, I think, is neglect, and I would agree wholeheartedly with the philosopher Siana Valentine-Schriffen when she argues that we've neglected for too long the moral importance of negligence, affording it less seriousness under the law than malice, leaving its motives under-examined by contrast with those of the malicious actor, including potentially a malicious state. Because then there is the really dark territory, if we've got the stomach to go there, the proliferating cultural material that asks us to consider that neglect of the old is, after all, a form of malice. Its effects are as bad, its cruelties as culpable. If Lucy Burke is right, even before the disaster of COVID, we'd come to understand our present-day care systems through a symbolic structural relationship between care and failure of care. The findings of investigative journalism into cruelty and neglect in care homes, social service, or in the UK Care Quality Commission reports into failures of training and practice, and increasingly criminal prosecutions of the perpetrators of abuse indicate to Burke that residential care functions in much the same way that Zizek has described sexual abuse in the Catholic Church. It is, she argues, an articulated counterculture within the current care system, not the exception, but the product of its very institutional symbolic organisation. She illustrates her claim by reference to a startling expansion of a subgenre of fiction and film, in which the obligation of care for an aging parent, often shouldered by a daughter, generates scenarios of relentless cruelty towards the cared for, the carers, and what remains, and often it's little enough, of the family unit. To Burke's chosen examples, Annie Ernaux's I Remain in Darkness, Julie Hilden's The Bad Daughter, Alice Sebold's The Almost Moon, I would add the care home portion of David Mitchell's Cloud Atlas, Peter Mullen's BBC miniseries The Fear, Elaine Feeney's As You Were, Atessa Moshfe's Death in Her Hands, the black comedy care section of Lionel Shriver's Should We Stay or Should We Go, and most recently Netflix, I Care a Lot, 2012 and 21, a kind of gone girl for the care home industry. Reforming care of the old is urgently needed. It's a subject capable of generating important ameliorations from various fields. Medicine, certainly, gerontology by definition, economics. The Dilnot report on funding care seems to me exemplary, but mustering the political will to enact it, partially, has taken more than a decade. Law, we could indeed do with better legislation, and I think a better legal philosophical set of arguments around neglect, what it means, where we see it, what it does. What should we expect of the humanities? They can assist all these endeavours by way of interpreting the culture in which such interventions must operate. But they also, I think, have a role to play in calibrating understanding of what can possibly be achieved through all the joint intelligence our societies can muster. The culture in which old age is experienced, in which if we're lucky we will experience it ourselves, is deeply incoherent, a mess, a really wicked problem. If you like, better just rich, complicated. Recognizing that incoherence, describing it, selecting out elements of it that have or should have significance, establishing lines of thought that let others grasp it better, shed some light, move the factors that can and should be moved. This is the ground on which the humanities, together with the social sciences, can and should work. We're in the terrain here not of expunging errors in public reasoning, though helping better public reasoning is surely part of it, so much as understanding and interpreting and putting critical pressure on the subjective and objective complexities, the situated experience, the language, the psychology, the inherited cultural, geographic and economic frameworks in which old age occurs and takes on its significance. The COVID pandemic gave us a very sharp reminder that life isn't equitable and it isn't predictable. On a day-to-day basis, it's often a matter of coping, of doing what we can under the circumstances, factors that vulnerability in old age greatly amplifies. In that context, it seems to me an intellectual contribution to commit to the problem, make it the subject of a higher order of conversation and put forth insights that will not all be integrated because the subject is incapable of complete integration. I go back to Mary Mothersill, not for the first time. We do not know how to feel about old age, she suggested in a very late paper to the American Philosophical Association, because we all hope to be exceptions to the general data. Number and human aspiration are at odds. Keeping that humane incoherence in the frame while committing to the social project of improving the broad tendencies seems to me no small basis on which to stake some of the combined value of the humanities and the social sciences. Thank you.
Helen, thank you so much. This is fantastically rich, intimidating to begin thinking where we can get into some questions here. We have around about 15, 20 minutes, and I do want to make sure we get some time for those who are in the audience to come in with some questions too. But there's a few issues that I think you raised, which, I mean, we're an Institute for Humanities and Social Sciences. We think about interdisciplinary politics the whole time. We address some of the many common concerns, the cliches of our trade. But there are some elements that you're talking about here which I think get beneath some of those cliches and I think tell us something important. And the first of the apparent cliches that I think you actually say something really important about is this idea of narrative and why it's so important to get it right if we as scholars in the disciplines of the humanities and social sciences want to do something that is meaningful, but also which allows us to bring a very particular perspective to bear. The example I'm thinking of is we had a working group on COVID-19 within the Institute who we set the task of going away for a year to think about what they would say as a group of scholars from different disciplines who, as you pointed out, don't necessarily share the same references, in fact, not at all, and to ask what it was in common they would think of as the essence of the problem. And what they ended up talking about was trust. And one area where they applied this was the government's Scientific Advisory Group on Emergencies, or SAGE, which was a bit of a, since we're talking about pandemics, a bit of a kind of, you know, a crisis of its own making in the sense, because here we had what was supposed to be the principal reference and authority on what scientists said we need to do, advising the government in a context in which their voice was not really being listened to or understood or believed because the transparency around that whole process was lacking. So it speaks to this question that you're talking about in terms of narrative, because yes, there's narrative. There are some of these styles of narrative that you mentioned, which I think is spot on. But then there's also the issue of the narrator and who is being narrated to, and how, in a sense, there's no narrative unless you speak from a position of authority, unless you can gain warrant for the arguments that you're making. And so I wonder then, you know, as those of us who come at this from different disciplinary backgrounds, what is there that we can say about that issue of narrative that is constructive in that context, where we don't simply want to critique something like SAGE for not sufficiently enlightening the country or enlightening the government, and fairness to them, they were talking to Boris, but in which we can give them something that can make their task more useful. So what is it in terms of narrative that could be useful in that context of the work of something like SAGE?
It's a really good example. It's a very interesting example. It seems to me there are 2 points at which the conversation about narrative is needed. One is the narrative you are telling about your own position in the room. You know, what are the set of interests that you bring with you? And that's a very standard conversation. It's simply the conflict of interest conversation that we all of us supposedly have at the start of any meeting. And that conversation, as I understand it, simply didn't happen at the right point, or didn't happen with transparency. But transparency is interesting because it requires another level of communication. It means that statement or set of conflicts of interest didn't just stay as a procedural moment in the room, but some kind of communication was made to the wider world, or indeed to the Prime Minister and Cabinet and so forth. And you've then got, if you like, a third order, which is the mediatization of that, or if you like, the public conversation around those interests, which is where it's not really a matter of expertise, it's a matter of judgment and conflicting judgments about whether those interests are properly accounted for in what flows from them. Is it enough just to state them and have them understood as biases, potential biases within the system, or do they need some kind of compensation? And that conversation gets corrected. The bit that always interests me is this is cost heavy. I mean, having those conversations it puts a lot of extra wordage in the system, and I actually do have some sympathy for the people responding, you know, where speed is of the essence at the first moment. And I'm not personally particularly unhappy that it was a rather untidy process where some of it spilled out afterwards. I think sort of a bit of righteousness of correction is inevitable. You know, after
and we would never do that in the humanities.
Yeah.
Which then brings me on a little bit to this context. I mean, what you say is normally in the context of the pandemic, but of course there is a history and a historical context behind this that is longer than that. And you know, interestingly, you took us back to the sort of moment of the wicked problems formulation, which itself, as you point out, comes out of this kind of 70s cultural context, the work of rules that you mentioned. And you know, that kind of got me thinking. There's a nice line by Brian Barry, and he sort of writes 2 rules after the initial reception, so before 71 actually, before the books come out. And he says, you know, great idea, this veil of ignorance, great idea, but there's one problem with it, and the one problem is nowhere in this veil of ignorance can you escape the idea that you're still in a liberal society, you know, which is all of the things that rules has, in a sense, packed into that, which come out of that particular moment. And I'm wondering whether, out of our particular moment then, are there things which are unsettled in the way that in the 70s, of course, so much was across philosophy, across sociology, but also across kind of economic and political life more broadly. There was this moment at which our prior settled understandings of what care was, or what was a functioning society, or what was an acceptable cost ratio for paying for some of these things, suddenly transformed, and we didn't have the right answers anymore. And I wonder, do you think that the pandemic, for all that it, in a sense, is a deus ex machina, it comes out of nowhere, do you think nonetheless it kind of begins to unsettle the settled state that we've been in, which is maybe, as many of us have been saying, not perhaps such a good place anyway? Is there something that comes out of these last 2 years that you see begins to open up, a crack where we can re-establish, refound some of these underlying values around care, around what we're prepared to pay for those things, around these, as you point out, the prioritization of what we need to sacrifice to enable certain ends that we want in society? Is this one of those moments?
The conversation was happening. Anybody working in old age has been having this conversation for ages. If you work with education, you do. So there's some absurdity to the short form of the answer. But yes, my answer would be that the pandemic puts a sudden dramatic focus on care and why care is a priority and what counts as a basic or acceptable minimum of care, if you like. But also beyond that, what counts as desirable, how far can we go with care and how much might be needed, and what is the on-flow socially. So it does that with old age, it does it with children and education, and it does it profoundly, I think, with regional inequality around this country. And that makes it possible to have arguments, and I'm not hearing at the moment, and I would love to hear more about the thing I'm trying to pull out here and to sort out in my own thinking, which is that it's not surprising Lucy Burke identifies a problem in the culture at the moment, which is that we seem, or artists, certain kind of creators of culture seem unhealthily eager to talk about really dark scenarios of neglect. Because unless you've got a concept of what constitutes neglect, you don't have an adequate concept of care. It's just inchoate without knowing when you're failing to care. So the missing piece of the argument, it seems to me, is what do we mean by negligence, which in a way that takes into account motive, but also the failure to pay attention. The Sienna Schriffen essay that I mentioned very briefly is articulating some initial thinking around this and what it might mean for the law, particularly in the US, and some really interesting arguments around Edward Snowden, who she suggests is oddly guilty of negligence, because even in paying attention to state failures, what he does is to neglect the structures of civic responsibility with which he could have been politically engaged. And the implication is therefore contributes to a failure of civic responsibility that was already unraveling around him and part of the problem. So some more joined thinking about what we are not doing has not been to the fore, I think, in considerations of how we spend our money or where our primary interests are. There's been such a long set of discussions about conflicting interests,
right,
but not so much. And I don't want to follow it necessarily in the direction that certain philosophers would want to of duties. It seems to me more about an interlocked argument about how a society works and what is happening anyway, and what is tolerable and desirable as a level of care for others and what is not.
Right. Yeah. And so maybe we unpick this notion of negligence a little. Then I think, picking up again on the point about the epoch in which some of these discussions are taking place. Negligence is something that's quite hard to legislate for in a way, but at the same time, it seems to me it's quite critical in the way that society operates on a kind of reduction of costs basis. We can talk a little bit about neoliberalism as the cult of the individual. We can talk about the kind of the dominant frame in contemporary liberal Western societies as being one where we seek to reduce costs, where we outsource, and Edward Snowden would be a good example of that, because he of course was working for Booz Allen Hamilton at the time, which is he would have been working for the FBI 40 years before, but now he's working for an outsourced agency, which is itself part of the moral problem of having that data before you've even leaked it. But negligence seems less of a challenge there than it does in the sort of in the moral core of a neoliberal ethos, which is really about how do you reduce the cost, how do you create a discourse, and here you turn perhaps to the humanities and others, in which you can secure public consent for the need not to care about certain things, not to pay certain amounts, that we accept that, no, that's just the offer we have, that we can't do this. This is no longer something that is internal or fundamental to the way in which our society works. We will have to leave individuals to figure this out on their own.
Right.
That strikes me as a form of societal negligence, which is distinctive perhaps to the individualized model of negligence that we might talk about and some of your interlocutors reference, but which in a sense is seems to me quite important to the problem that humanities can solve, because at that less moralized but more socialized level of a structure within society, presumably we can say some things about negligence, can't we?
Yeah, not for the first time I find myself, with a really attractive, line of potential argument for humanities advocacy here, and I immediately want to hold myself back, because you go down that track, and what we're saying potentially is the humanities are uniquely well positioned and have the intellectual tools to have precisely that conversation, to bring, to counter the dominance of interest, to think about care and neglect and put the messiness of the system in. I am saying a version of that. But of course, this is the conversation that we're trying to have as all disciplines together. So it's really about how you mediate that conversation and make it possible to communicate those things, where you're not trying to give the explanatory priority, if you like, to one set of answers, but to see those answers residing within a society.
And I guess then the critical bearers of that request, and I'll come to the audience in a moment for your questions, is the research councils, is those we turn to seek funding for these things. And this is, I thought this was one of the really interesting lines in your argument here, is that you want to try to connect these questions around what we as humanities and social sciences scholars do with the conditions for which we are able to do that. I think, there's lots wrong with the way in which we go about securing research, from the use, the narrative, if you like, the narrative form of a research proposal, which is supposed to consist of work packages 1, 2, and 3, and we think about the effect, the heuristic effect that has on how you can think. These people will do work package 1, these people will do work package 2, we'll join at the end, we'll have somebody that will do a little bit of adding up, and we'll come out with a nicely summative account at the end that the Research Council can package up. That's a very cynical take on what research involves, I recognise, but there's something written into that from the start when we apply for research in certain sorts of ways. So when it comes to the question of our expectations of the funders of the research councils, what is it that you think needs to be
I should say I'm
different?
not really criticising the councils and the funding bodies. I think I'm talking to the converted here, or to several bodies of people who are already trying to do this, but I'm strongly encouraging them to do more of it. One is, I think there is work to do in digging deeper, giving us and encouraging, encouraging those academics who receive money to do joined and difficult interdisciplinary work to give a deeper account of where it led at the end. When I talk about the blandification of research findings, it's partly that problem of concision. You look at websites and they give you very, very little information. But if you think about the presentational mode that's encouraged by a lot of that material, it really doesn't tell you where the novelty or where the complexity or where the interest of what was tackled in the course of those grants lies. There's also, I think, a job to be done in communicating back to the sector where there is room for extension of what has been done, where something has started to be opened up, where, I'm sure they all have, and one knows when you get into the room with some of those conversations, it's definitely there, but it doesn't get out into the system as widely as it could, maybe because there's a worry about everybody copying the model that seemed to have worked. But you really want to know where there is capacity to take something that's already been done well and to build on that and make that part of what happens next. I think they are trying to do that, but there's a very interesting one which I think possibly would be an efficiency difficulty for government funding, probably easier for private funders, and that is to assess quality. Where do they think the real quality lay in what they funded? What do they think was really good investment and what was not?
Right.
Yeah.
So I wonder whether we have any questions from colleagues in the audience.
Will.
Just one sec.
Mute until you have one.
I'm sure you can project your voice, but...
So it was a question about tone.
Yeah.
So kind of linking into what you said about websites, but also about since 2006 when I've been at university, you go to lots of crisis and humanities public lectures, and you read lots of New Yorker articles about public humanities, and I liked how at the start you said, I'm going to be slightly, there's going to be moments when I'm not going to agree with everything that everyone says. Because I think there's something about public humanities presentation that tends towards agreeability of tone all the time, kind of relentlessly. And that comes out in...
So I think I missed the crucial adjective, tends towards a what of tone?
Agreeability.
Agreeability, yeah.
You don't want to wish for thunder that you didn't come out where you wanted to come out at the end.
Yeah.
Or that actually this collaboration between law and philosophy wasn't as successful, etc., etc. So there's that kind of thing. If the humanities have been in crisis for 13 years, let's say, or probably longer, there's a kind of pathological meaning of crisis. Something has to happen. We have to have the strength to bring the moment to this crisis, right? Something has to go. Might it be just a kind of change of tone of being a bit more, not honest is the wrong term, because honesty also implies a kind of amenability. Being a bit more disagreeable, being a bit more prepared to say when something isn't going the right way and the kind of big circle of interdisciplinary love isn't working.
It would be interesting. Scientists do this all the time, don't they? I mean, a negative finding is a finding, as we're all told in graduate school by our scientist friends. It would be very interesting to see the terms of irresolvable disagreement set out more often in work, or to see the points at which two things just have to sit alongside each other and actually, are doing different work in a different context. I get really worried by the way in which words that are supposed to cover over that problem for us get taken up. So one is narrative, another is affordances. I mean, there are words in the vocabulary of humanists at the moment that just seem to be providing the glue, if you like. And yes, I mean, of course, we would all love to have a way of doing that talk. But what I'm trying to do is to articulate why does it still seem so difficult? Unless other people aren't having the difficulties, it seems to me that it is still very, very difficult. And what you do when you talk to graduate students on, for example, we have some, I'm sure your university does, at the Well, who are looking for a specific training in interdisciplinarity, you're actually telling them to do something quite basic, which is to invest a lot of time in the relevant literature of another discipline and to learn its internal codes, rather than to simply alight and pick up something, or to try to have a conversation over the top with somebody else who is speaking partly a different language. So it's trying to it's really a depth conversation. What's the level of depth that you need to be able to operate at to say something genuinely meaningful on both sides? Yeah.
I mean, I think there's something important, because there is an assumption that doing interdisciplinary work is purely synthetic. That we add 1 + 1 and we get 2.5. And of course it's not. And it is, as you say, it's about recognizing disagreement. And this is why I wonder whether actually it's the problem with the research culture is partly actually us and the way that we address it, and that we set for ourselves tasks which are, intended to identify answers that will be digestible, can be narrativized and useful, socially useful. But the value of what we do is not necessarily defined in those terms. The insight, the value of an insight, the value of wisdom might actually be the very opposite. It might be simply the things we didn't find, the learning of what was not possible, the fact that we really didn't get on with those lawyers. It could be lots of different things, but we don't really allow scope for that in the way that we set up research for ourselves, which includes the way we apply for funding, but it's also more than that. It's also about how we think through what it is we're doing as scholars in this sort of rich, diverse, but also somewhat, lacking in a basic cartography of how we take forward these insights. And again, it makes me come back to this point at the beginning, that one wonders whether we are in a moment where the moorings have been lost a little, and that there might be some need for disciplines to rethink what they do, as well as interdisciplinary work to rethink what it does, and then somehow to reconvene later on. But I get the sense neither that we're in a sort of golden age of intellectual inquiry, but also in a more positive vein that we're prepared, perhaps for the first time in a while, to recognise that. and to act upon it?
When I said, and I absolutely believe it, I think there are at least two groups of intellectuals who have a built-in advantage, and they're the anthropologists and the historians, or people dealing with any form of intellectual or social history, which can simply look back in the system and see where things were able to talk to each other more nearly, and then identify on that basis how they still talk to each other even if they don't know it. I think that's very interesting, or even the story of how they diverge. So they really do have an advantage. The disadvantage for them is, I think, increasingly pressing, and it's obviously a problem for what we do in almost all of our disciplines. I'd be surprised if there were many exceptions in this room, and that is that long forms of knowledge are increasingly problematic. I only mentioned this very briefly, but for a department of English literature like my own, it is a huge challenge to address a culture in which the dominant forms of cultural material are now very short form. They're short form, they're primarily film and video and moving image. They're not long form text based, and I set that obvious observation in my head alongside what I hear medical scientists saying to humanities people in my own university, which is much as they would like to see the in-depth representation of individual human experience or community experience through narratives, through, for example, interviewing people, producing the qualitative goods, or reading the culture's narratives in the form of whatever stories it circulates in whatever medium. It's too time expensive. If you want an answer to a social challenge, you simply can't invest that level of attention in long form text. Those are huge pressures. John Guillory's much looked forward to book on the profession is coming out right now, and as I understand it from what's been in the media already, he puts a very strong spotlight on that question of what will the dominant medium of culture be in the near future, because we need to understand that in order to make that contribution, not just as humanists but as social scientists as well.
Yeah, exactly. And it's interesting that you mentioned that book, because this is actually fundamentally about the time we have as intellectual labourers as much as individuals within disciplines. And so perhaps the roots of the challenge of interdisciplinarity in the pandemic, in the current moment, is as much the challenge of work in the present for all of us. Yeah. And you spoke about humility in the lecture, and I wonder whether that's one form of humility we might all take forward.
There are lots of forms of cultural experience for which we do need new maps. When I said at the end, one of the jobs that we need to do is actually to re-describe the culture to itself, because so much in it has changed. So if you want to understand, for example, the problem in front of me is, how do I give a sufficiently rich account of how the culture represents old age and care to itself? Because there's a very, very wide range of generic forms and media out there, and not all of them are obvious to us, and probably most of us haven't encountered all of them. So simply understanding what people absorb as representations of aging and care is a significant task.
Yeah. Yes. Sally, yeah, there's a mic on its way.
It's just going to link this discussion back to SAGE and pandemic and advice, because they're interesting that you did have interdisciplinary layers. There was sub-SAGE, but they then fed into SAGE, and you did have a historian on, and so there was an attempt to actually bring all these disciplines together, but then you get the funneling up, and then you get the scientists disagreeing, but you still need to have the narrative for the public that goes, science says this. That was the pressures upon them. And so I think it's very interesting for the scientists involved, because they felt sort of that they didn't want to come to a coherent answer, but were forced to by the pressures that they were under. And so I think this links also to the whole problems with long form and the demand that you actually deliver, and you say what your impact's going to be and the straight trajectory. But things that we've learned in terms of pandemic, the importance of sociology, for example, and history. What was one of the greatest failings is that nobody on the panels knew that care workers were actually working several jobs. If they had known that, and that they were actually facilitating forms of transmission from home to home. And so I think a lot of things have come out of the pandemic which have shown the need for very wide scope thinking, in which hopefully narrative of the most complex and interesting kind might actually have a role. But faced with government demands for a paragraph, the sort of what are you going to deliver, it is a struggle.
Well, somebody has to make a judgment somewhere, so to extent, they just have to live with that, and indeed they are living with that. But the question of what we didn't know, part of the issue for me is what is a question of knowledge and what is a question of intervention in the culture and change the culture's self-representation to itself, because there is a lot that we did not know, are starting to know better about, for example, carers, what kinds of work they do, where they come from, whether they're part of the communities they're in or imported into the community, or what their economic circumstances are. That's about cultural recognition, and the more we get stories and representations on film and so forth of people doing those jobs, the better. But there's a separate issue, which is a question of whether it's the further down the cycle, if you like, that the more one is put in the way of that knowledge, the more one would hope that the culture itself starts to change, that the stories it tells to itself, the way in which it talks to itself down the line is changing. That isn't a question of what we can as academics or intellectuals put in the system at the beginning. It's more of a ramification down the line, if you like, and we certainly won't be the only ones doing the job. And then there's the basic question of political will. I heard Andrew Dillnut, I'm sure I'm not the only one presenting, at last the move to enact the Care Bill, and talking about really it wasn't a problem of knowledge. It was very clear what the economic changes, the financial changes, the taxation changes needed to be. It was a problem of mustering the will to attend to the problem in the first place and to make it a priority over others, and that lies elsewhere.
So we need to do more than clap for carers, right? We need to to stop there and think, and then take it forward. Are there any final questions? Yes.
That's the end.
I just had a small question that I was interested, I think it was echoed by Sally at this point, that public pressures and funding pressures can sometimes very much counteract what you call the feasibility awareness, or which you translate into the sort of awareness, the discipline's sort of self-awareness of its limitations. And so I wondered if you had a worry perhaps that these pressures, these intense pressures, were also causing a bad interdisciplinarity, or a sense that you have pressure to make these big claims because you need all claims that get slightly wrong because you don't know the other discipline that well, and you have this sense of pressure and also limited time in which to make your big claims, and that this is a sort of unsustainable system for what's going on.
I think embittered, I was trying to say embattled. I think embattled disciplines have a different orientation, if you like, towards the need for a certain kind of feasibility awareness, and for the ones that feel more confident of where they're at. Because if you're feeling embattled and you think the future of your discipline is in question, it's terribly easy. I mean, I would take my own subject to be one of them, to find oneself making grander statements than are allowable. It's a sort of counter mechanism, or a resistance to a perceived potential irrelevance to the debate, that you up the claims beyond what the material in front of you justifies. But you also see, I think it's just a matter of where one pitches the argument, and we've all got, institutes like this have an enormously important role to play in them, which is making sure that the argument hits a high enough level, that we don't get into a room and think that we have to simplify, blandify, as I keep saying, in order to be able to talk to each other at all. Everybody in the room is a highly intelligent person in their own field. I just don't think it should be so difficult to introduce terms, explain them as you go, and push the argument on from where it is. And I continue to think actually that in the policy world that is wanted rather than resented, that actually a higher level of, a deeper, a more complicated conversation is really welcomed, because that policy world is so repetitive, it is so reiterative, it has to be, because as the conversation is being had again and again and again in different rooms. So I think actually putting more of our own disciplinary specialism into that conversation when we have the opportunity is a good thing. It's balance, it's judgment, always is.
Things we have in abundance.
Yeah.
Danai, last question, and then we'll wrap up.
Okay.
Thank you very much. pandemic, there was a call to kind of action, whether it was it in form of immobility or shielding in a way of like social, like the lack perhaps of social mobilization around certain issues. And it feels that that also relates with the need to, with the rise of conspiratorial thinking, for example, and how it kind of allowed to connect dots in a way that was necessary to act. And I was wondering whether you think there is a way to disassociate uncertainty with inaction, and whether there's a way to, to kind of, rather than trying to create a narrative, whether we need to find a way to show how narrativism should not necessarily be a precondition for action.
One of my favourite repeated experiences of, when you sit in the grant, the committee in your university dividing up the grants between subjects, it's something a social scientist said to me early on in my experience of this with complete exasperation, which is that literary scholars, she said to me, always act as if the only thing that's worth talking about is text and language and is purely rhetorical, as if no institution ever existed. And the converse is that the people interested in institutions don't think at all about rhetoric and about what is happening in social structures beyond. It's a very, very obvious point, but then it becomes funny when you articulate what's the equivalent in medical sciences or sciences and what are their predilections for the kind of work they want to see done. This is a roundabout way of saying, I think, discriminating between what we need to know and what we need institutionally in order to enact the change, that's a kind of critical area for deciding what our job is as literary or historical or social scientific scholars and where it's going beyond. It comes back to the negligence conversation, because that's the accusation that Sienna Schriffen is making against Edward Snowden, is that there is a failure to understand that there were structures available that were not operated through. And that isn't a problem of knowledge, it's not a problem of a diagnosis of the political error or the political culpabilities, it's a failure to direct yourself through the right channels. Yeah, I'm not sure that's a very good answer, but it's at least how I would divide up the problem. Yeah.
So Georges Congalé once said, that he's a great aphorist. He once said, every society has the morbidity that it deserves. And
horrible.
And yet true. And I wonder whether the same is true of the humanities. That we have the humanities that we deserve. And therefore, the question that we need to address is really whether actually it's about how we labour within them, how we do the work, how we find the time, how we incorporate new understandings of care and the sorts of things we do. And your work, Helen, has been a real, inspiration in terms of the sorts of challenges you're taking on, the very material, political, policy domain that you are taking these discussions into. You mentioned there's an appetite for that. I hope there is, but it also requires the right voice. And you've certainly been one of those. It's been a pleasure hearing you talk this evening. Thank you for your insights, and please come again.
Thank you. Thank you very much.